Chapter 28. "We're here," Cameron said as she pulled up alongside a large white house surrounded by open ground. She'd been here before only once, and John twice. The first time to stop his mother killing an innocent man, and the second time was unsuccessfully for information. They hadn't been welcome on either occasion. "You're letting me go." Danny stared out his back seat window at his house. He hadn't been there in months, strictly forbidden from making contact with his mother or from going anywhere unescorted, even in his weeks off back in the world. Noel's had been an almost constant presence, like his own shadow, and the two had even been forced to share twin hotel rooms paid for by Kaliba. The thought of sleeping in his own bed, and more importantly, seeing his mom and sister again, was almost too much. "There's no point in keeping you anymore." John looked back from the front passenger seat at him. "You told us the truth. We're letting you go. That was the deal." Danny looked at him and Cameron, slightly stunned. "I didn't think you'd honor it," he said quietly. He'd been half expecting them to shoot him and dump his body out in the desert or something. "I told you, we're not the bad guys," John said. "Unless you tell the police or Kaliba about us," Cameron added threateningly. "If you do, I'll kill you." Danny unconsciously gulped, nervous and terrified of Cameron. He didn't doubt for a second she meant it. She could kill him easily without any effort, or any feeling even. He thought Noel's was a cold, hard bastard. He was a sweetheart compared to her. "I won't," Danny replied, shaking his head. "I'm not going back to Kaliba. I'll get a job at Microsoft or something. Just don't ever try to build an AI again," John said. A thought suddenly came to him, and he opened his door and stepped out. "What are you doing?" Cameron glanced at him, curious. They were supposed to drop off Danny and leave. She got out and looked to him across the roof of the car, as Danny also exited the Lexus. "I think Tarissa deserves an explanation," he replied. He stepped towards the front door as Cameron and Danny followed suit. He rang the bell, waited. He heard movement inside as someone approached the door, and a moment later catches and locks clicked open. The door opened, and Tarissa's face appeared. She looked older, much older and haggard. Her hair was a mess and she had bags under her eyes. She stared at John, and it took a moment to recognize him. "You!" She glared at him in barely concealed hatred and tried to slam the door shut, but John wedged his boot in the door and pushed it open. "What do you want?" She snapped, but as the door swung around, she saw the machine end. "Danny!" Her knees almost buckled beneath her at the sight of her son, and she trembled, tears already forming in her eyes. "It's me, Mom." Danny pushed past John and threw his arms around his mother, pulling her into a hug. He could feel her sobbing into him, and it was all he could do not to join in. "Where have you been?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You said you had a job, and then you disappeared." She turned to John and Cameron. "You did this," she accused them. "You got him caught up in all of it, just like his father." John shook his head, though he doubted she'd believe anything he said. Actually, we found him by accident," he told her, remembering how Ellison had told him in the future that he and his mom had found him when they'd been sneaking through Zyra Corp. Danny stepped back from Tarissa for a moment, and his mom led them all inside. She took them into their living room and sat down on the couch next to her son. John and Cameron took a sofa opposite. He started to say something, but Danny cut him off. "I took a job with a company called Kaliba. They wanted me to build an AI, so I did. They flew us, me and a team of other computer scientists and engineers, somewhere in the mountains, middle of nowhere, and we went to work. We spent 2 weeks at work and another week back on leave." "And you didn't think to call me?" Tarissa asked angrily. "I was worried sick, Danny. I called the police, hired private detectives. I wasn't allowed to call home," Danny protested, or speak to anyone I knew. They took our cell phones and everything. No contact with friends or family until the job was done. There were no phones in the labs we worked in and restricted internet access. Even on leave, I had a minder, making sure I didn't break the rules. He'd tried a few times, public payphones, internet cafe. Knowles had stuck to him like glue. They didn't want him to learn the truth, Cameron explained. Tarissa's eyes narrowed as she looked at Cameron. Not what she was, she knew that, but for what she said. Her words resonated through her mind, and images of Miles flashed up. What truth? She asked, fairly sure what she meant but hoping beyond anything she was wrong. They're starting it all again, John said. Trying to blow up the world, create Skynet and wipe us all out. Why? She asked. That was the one thing she didn't get, was the motives behind it all. If these are people, why are they doing it? Greys, Cameron answered. People who sided with Skynet in the future. They work for the machines, so Skynet won't kill them. They don't think we can win. They serve Skynet, believing it will spare them when it wins. It won't. She knew well that, if Skynet had won the war, it would kill the humans who'd allied with it. They were useless to it and a potential liability. They're digging all our graves so they can join what they see as the winning side. Danny fell into the same trap as his father, unwittingly helping the machines. The younger Dyson shook his head adamantly. I told you, I'm not going back to them. It wasn't as simple as that, and both John and Cameron knew it. The AI you built is self-aware already, Cameron said. They're waiting for the infrastructure so Skynet can control strategic assets. In English, Tarissa asked. Nukes, John said. It's waiting for the military to give it control of the nukes and unmanned drones, and then it'll attack. We're trying to stop it. Dread filled Tarissa as she remembered the exact same thing happening with Miles. He joined them last time around and gotten himself killed, and that still hadn't stopped it all. You're not taking Danny. She wrapped her arms protectively around him. We don't plan to, John said. We came here to drop him off. He's done everything he can for us. We've got to do the rest ourselves. But you can't stay here, Cameron told her. Kaliba might expect you to come home, she said to Danny. You need to leave. Somewhere safe. Mexico, John said, remembering Savannah's tale, how she and Ellison had hidden out there. Stay remote. No computers, no cell phones, off the grid. His pocket vibrated against his upper thigh, and he pulled out his cell phone, ringing on silent. That's our cue to leave, he told Cameron as he made his way towards the front door. Take care of yourself, Danny. Cameron followed after him, not attempting any kind of farewell to Danny or his mother, leaving them to their reunion. As soon as they were out of the front door, John put the phone to his ear and pressed to answer it. Yeah. John, we've just come from Malenkov's. He recognized Ellison's voice on the line. He's told us the job he wants us to do. What is it? He asked, detecting an air of uneasiness in the man's tone. He wants Savannah to kidnap a rival arms and drug dealer, name of Westinghouse, and deliver him to his doorstep where he'll probably be tortured and killed. Savannah's said she'll do it, but I'm not happy about it. John frowned at the reply. They weren't murderers, but even if they weren't pulling the trigger, they'd still be guilty by proxy. The name meant something to Cameron, however. She gestured for John to hand her the phone. He passed it over to her, seeing the urgency on her face. Is that Kevin Westinghouse? She asked. Same one, Ellison replied. Do it, Cameron told him firmly. John stared at her in horror, thinking she'd learnt the value of human life by now. But he could see something going on in her head. He didn't know what, but he was going to trust her on this. He took the phone back from her. John, do you really want us to go ahead with this? He looked to Cameron for a moment and saw the determination on her face. Do it, John sighed. Make sure Malenkov tells us everything he knows about Knowles. He hung up the phone and put it back in his pocket. Why did I just tell Ellison to let Savannah capture this guy and sign his death warrant? He asked. He trusted Cameron's judgment, but he wanted to know why she wanted him dead. Next year, Kevin Westinghouse steals classified plans for an experimental prototype, directed energy weapon. Later, he'll give the plans to Skynet in exchange for his own life. Skynet uses the plans as a base for plasma weaponry. The guy Malenkov's going to kill is a Gray. John couldn't believe just how small the world was getting. What the hell were the odds of that? Not yet, Cameron said. He will be. Wouldn't Skynet have the plans anyway? John asked. Why would Skynet need plans from a human when it would have access to everything in the U.S. military network? The plans are Japanese. Made sense, John thought. He realized now that they'd made a sound move. Even if they couldn't prevent the war, with Westinghouse out of the picture, Skynet's development of plasma weapons could be delayed, meaning the HKs and Centaurs in the future would have to rely on missiles and cannons, meaning they had to be constantly rearmed and resupplied. And that was a weakness they could exploit. Danny watched John and Cameron walk out the front door and remained rooted in the chair as it clicked shut after them. His mom said something, but he didn't hear it. All he'd wanted for days was to come home, to see his mom and sister again. But now he was here, it didn't feel right. Danny, are you listening to me? He snapped his head towards his mom, not realizing he'd completely zoned out. Sorry, Mom, he said. What did you say? I said, I'll call your sister and we'll go out for dinner tonight. I'd better call the police too and tell them to call off the search now you're back. She got up and went to the phone, hung on the wall. Danny shot up out of his seat, tore the phone from her grip, and slammed it back into the cradle. Tarissa shot him a look as if he'd grown horns. What are you doing? Didn't you listen to a word they said? Danny glared at her. We can't call the police. I wasn't going to tell them anything about the Connors. It doesn't matter what you tell them, he stressed. It wasn't her fault. She knew nothing about AI or what his one was capable of. If you call the police, it goes straight to the AI I built. It'll know I'm here and they'll send mercenaries after us. They've got their own private army. So what do we do? Tarissa asked irritably. The police have been looking for you, and your sister will want to know you're home and safe. Like John said, we hide. You mean we just give up our whole lives? She couldn't do that. Blythe was in her senior year at school. She couldn't just up sticks and move like that. For how long? The question struck Danny hard. If they did hide, how long would it be for? Would he have to spend his life on the run? How would he ever know if John managed to stop Skynet? Would he just have to wait and see if the world blew up? Running and hiding was okay for a while, he thought. They had plenty of money. They could move to another country, create new identities, could even get new faces at a stretch, but that would really be pushing it. What kind of life would that be? He wondered, running and hiding and always looking over your shoulder. He'd have no future. Everything he'd worked so hard for would be for nothing. He couldn't live like that. The only way he could see of avoiding that kind of life was to make sure he didn't have to live it, which was exactly what John was doing. Until I call you, he said, realizing what he had to do. Where are you going? He pointed out to the front door. With them. No, Tarissa said sharply and held on to him. Your father died like that. I won't let it happen to you too. Danny pried her hands off him and looked at her, feeling guilty about what he was going to do. I'm sorry, he said remorsefully as he got up off the couch, strode to the front door and left. He saw the black Lexus pulling out of the drive and ran after it, waving his arms above his head to get their attention. "Wait!" he cried out, sprinting towards them. The car stopped and turned so the passenger side faced him, and John leaned out the open window. "Danny, go back inside." "I can't," he said. "It's too dangerous," John insisted. "And I'm supposed to just run and hide." "I can't, I won't. I made Skynet, I'm responsible for all this. Without me, there'd be no Skynet." Danny knew now that he had to help them. Not working for Kaliba wasn't enough, as Cameron had said. The AI was self-aware, and Kaliba were making it into a machine of war. If John failed, then the end of the world would be on him. He didn't want that kind of guilt. "We don't need you," Cameron added. "Your mother does." "You do need me," he shouted at her. "You find out where they are, then what? You run around blindly in the complex, whilst their private army massacres you. I can tell you where you need to go, where the AI based, where the server farms are, the layout of the building. I want to help." John stared at him for a moment and saw a resolve on his face that reminded him of when he was 15, after he'd met Cameron and realized it had all started again, how he'd begged for them to stop it instead of running and hiding. Danny had a point, though. Without that knowledge, they'd be going in blind. "Get in," he said simply. Danny opened the door behind him and got into the back seat. Cameron put her foot down on the gas and pulled away before he'd put a seatbelt on or even closed the door. She thought it was a bad idea to include Danny. She didn't think he'd inform the police or Kaliba, but in their world, he was little use. He couldn't fight, didn't know how to shoot, and knew nothing about surveillance or guerrilla warfare. His knowledge of the Kaliba complex and its layout would be useful, but he could give her detailed plans, and she'd instantly memorize them. They didn't need him for that. She trusted John's judgment, however, like he trusted hers, and she'd support his decision. The car drove away from the Dyson residence for 100 yards, reminding John of the time Cromarty had chased them and the bomb in Cameron's truck that she'd used to slow him down. "Stop," he told her. Cameron pulled over again, and John turned around in his seat to face Danny, his eyes boring into him. "If you're with us, you're all in," he said. "No half-asses. You do what I say, when I say it. You know what we're up against. There's a very real chance none of us will make it through this. Last chance to go home." Danny said nothing for a moment. He just watched the hard, intense gaze of the younger man. John was a few years his junior, but there was no way he was a boy. That much was clear. Part of him was sorely tempted to get out of the car and go back home to his mom, after months of not knowing he was alive or dead, and he'd only been home for 5 minutes. It wasn't fair on her, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to stop it from happening. "I'm in," he said, hoping he sounded more sure about it than he felt. Cameron put her foot on the gas again and drove off, leaving the wealthy residential district in their dust. John looked at Cameron and then back at Danny. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out his Sig Sauer, held it by the barrel and passed it to Danny, who looked at the weapon but was hesitant to take it. "It's yours," John told him. "If you're with us, you'll need it." Danny took the weapon from him and held it in his right hand. It was heavier than he'd thought it would be. His finger automatically curled into the trigger guard, and his probed what he thought was the safety button with his thumb. "Don't touch the trigger." Cameron snapped at him, noting that the barrel was in John's direction, and if it accidentally went off, the bullet would hit him. "Sorry," Danny said sheepishly, placing the weapon on the seat next to him, afraid to even touch the thing now. "We'll have to show you how to use it," John realized aloud. He took the weapon, unloaded the magazine, and pulled the top slide back to clear the chamber, ejecting the chambered round from the breech. He handed it back to Danny. "Play around with it," he said. "Get a feel for it. You're one of us now, and I guarantee before this is over you'll have to use it. Welcome to the team. Analyzing intrusion into U.S. Defense Network. Analyzing. This is taking too long, Coleman muttered impatiently. He'd assumed an AI as sophisticated as this one would be able to find out who had hacked the defense network without any problems. But so far it had taken over a day, and it still hadn't traced it yet. Who the hell can even hack it like that? A supercomputer with brute force attacks would take years, and this thing took what, 20 seconds? The hack lasted 18.6 seconds. Steroids corrected him. That's very little time to run a trace. It will take time. Time is exactly what we don't have, Coleman shot back. He pulled out a pack of Morleys, pulled one out, put it between his lips and lit it up, taking a long drag and feeling the almost instantly soothing effect of the nicotine as it hit his bloodstream. He ignored the no smoking sign on the wall and Steroid's disapproving stare. He knew the cyborg cared nothing for his health or that of any other human, but he and Baldy O, how he loved the names that Sergeant Knowles had bestowed upon the two machines, were extremely anal about any risk to Skynet, and that included fire hazards. He took another drag, sucking on the cigarette, before continuing. The Connors are out there still. Danny Dyson's still missing, and now Knowles has fucked off to who knows where. Our team's attempts to apprehend Knowles have been unsuccessful, Nagace added. The machines couldn't be anxious, because they were machines, but also because it wasn't their asses on the line if things went wrong. They wouldn't be the ones found face down in a ditch with a bullet in their skull. He, Coleman, and the others would. His family are also missing. Surveillance of the Dyson residence has provided no clues, and the Connors have disappeared. They're out there, Steroids told them calmly. Skynet will find them. The LCD screen on the wall that Skynet used to communicate with them changed, drawing the attention of the two men and the cyborg to it. Analysis complete. What did you find? Coleman asked it. The AI had voice recognition software, so he knew it understood every word he said. The intruder is like me. Another one. Nagace's eyes widened. Is it the same one as before? Unknown. That worried Coleman considerably. How could it not know if it was the same one before? But it couldn't be, surely. The other AI gone along with Catherine Weaver, he said. Negative, Steroids argued. Catherine Weaver's body was never recovered, and Danny Dyson reported the hostile AI was missing. It had been downloaded to another computer. Its location is unknown. Coleman stubbed his cigarette out onto the surface of a wooden desk in the room and immediately pulled out another. This was a day when one just wouldn't do. The intruder is another AI, identity unknown. Data shares some similarities with missing John Henry AI. I have traced the source of the intrusion into the defense network. Well, that's something, Coleman thought. What is their location? Steroids asked. A map appeared on the screen of Southern California, which zoomed into LA County and panned east. A red dot appeared on the screen and flashed continuously as a set of grid coordinates appeared in a small box above it, displaying their exact coordinates. In the desert, some distance north of Big Bear. That's where Zyracorp's AI is. Coleman shot up, almost ready to dance a jig in celebration. How the hell had it remained hidden all this time? We think it's Zyracorp's AI, Nagace reminded him. Skynet can't tell if it's the same one or not. Though the odds of another, similar AI being out there were pretty slim. Wait, Steroids instructed them as he watched the screen. There's something else. A face appeared on the screen. A man in his 50s with light brown hair and flecks of gray at the sides, dressed in a suit. His high cheekbones gave him a Slavic appearance, and he looked like a wealthy man who kept himself in excellent condition. Better than me, Coleman thought. The years had been kinder to this man, whoever he was, than to him. As he smoked the Morley, he reflected that he'd probably lived a life of excess once he'd been back in the past. It was the curse of anyone from the future, to indulge themselves after years of deprivation. "Who's this?" he asked. "Sasha Dmitry Malenkov. Age 54. Nationality, Ukrainian. Arms dealer employed by Central Intelligence Agency." His address appeared on screen beneath his photo. Target must be eliminated. Another red dot revealed the location of his home and a grid reference, and one further indicator flashed on an old industrial estate in the city. Coleman couldn't help the wolfish grin that spread across his lips. He saw it on Nagace's as well, and although steroids never actually smiled, he could imagine the T-800 was pleased to some degree. Weaver had dealt with Sarah Connor at least once, from the security images they'd procured from Zyra Corp. Her AI had been missing, but Skynet had found something similar. Was this the same AI, adapted somehow, or a new one, perhaps a second attempt? It didn't matter. The location was the best lead to Weaver, the AI, and John and Sarah Connor they were going to get. They weren't about to let them slip through their grasp now. The bar was softly lit, and music played quietly in the background, providing a relaxed yet classy atmosphere to the place. At early evening, it wasn't particularly busy, and there were only a few occupied tables. Ellison sat opposite Savannah at one such table in the corner of the bar, the former drinking an extortionate $12 bottle of beer, and the latter with a glass of orange juice, and lemonade that cost not much less. Ellison was glad the mission would be a one-off. He couldn't afford to hang out in places like this too many times, especially as he had no income now and the only money they had was what was stored under the floorboards in the safe house. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Ellison asked her. "We can back out if you want. We'll find it out another way." "It's fine," Savannah shrugged. "I really don't agree with this," he added. Even if Cameron and Malenkov were right, Danny Dyson created Skynet, but they hadn't just killed him. Even if they'd managed to get to him before he'd built it. "Feels like murder," he said before taking a swig of his beer. "I know how you feel about it," Savannah said to him. "You used to always carry your Bible around in the future, everywhere we went. I know what it means to you, your faith, morals, and all. I take it you didn't agree with me?" He asked. He reckoned if he raised Savannah, he'd try to instill some faith in her, something to believe in. They could all use some of that right now, he thought. Savannah had been sipping her drink as he'd spoken, and she'd almost snorted it out her nose. The idea was so funny. "Me? Hell no. Heckler and Koch did a lot more for me than God ever did." She saw Ellison looking at her uncomfortably and realized she might have upset him. "I'm no good at this kind of thing," she thought. "But I always had faith in you," she said, catching his gaze. "You never let me down." Ellison smiled at that, feeling proud that on some level he'd helped her, even if it hadn't technically happened yet. His attention was torn from the conversation as a striking brunette, in a black dress, seemed to glide through the front entrance of the bar. She looked around and he got a good look at her. She was several inches taller than Savannah, and looking at her face he could tell she was half Oriental, giving her a mysterious, exotic look. "That's her," he murmured to Savannah. She had the good sense not to turn around and look, and waited until the woman passed by before catching a glimpse out the corner of her eye. The woman, according to Malenkov, Westinghouse's escort for the evening, looked around the bar, saw that her client wasn't yet here, and headed for the restroom. Savannah downed the rest of her drink, waited until the escort had disappeared, got up and followed after her. "I'll just be a moment," she said to Ellison, who handed a roll of gaffer tape to her under the table. She marched into the bathroom and saw the woman in there, standing at the sinks and touching up her makeup. She stood beside her and pretended to inspect her own face, though she had no makeup at all on hers. The escort pulled lipstick out of her purse and applied another layer of dark red onto her lips as Savannah looked on. "Do you mind if I borrow some?" she asked. "Sorry," the woman smiled condescendingly. "I don't share, honey. Why don't you ask the man you were with to get you some?" He seemed the generous type. "I asked nicely," Savannah shrugged nonchalantly. She slammed her elbow into the woman's chin as hard as she could, snapping her head backwards and forcing the woman to cry out. Savannah gripped the escort's wrists before she fell backwards, pulled her closer and forced her knee into her gut, knocking the wind out of her and dropping her to her knees. A roundhouse kick to the side of her head sent her sprawling to the ground unconscious. No time at all was wasted as Savannah locked the restroom door, stripped off the escort's black dress, pulled the roll of gaffer tape from her pocket, and set to work. She dragged her unconscious burden into one of the cubicles and wrapped the tape around the fingers on each of her hands, binding them together until they resembled fins more than anything else. It would render her fingers useless in trying to pick the rest of the tape and free herself, should she regain consciousness too soon. Next, she bound her wrists together around the base of the porcelain toilet bowl, wrapping it around several times to ensure it would hold her securely in place. Next, she ripped a length of tape off and sealed the woman's mouth shut. She tied her legs together at the ankles, too. Savannah stood up and admired her handiwork. The escort was unconscious, in lacy black underwear, and tied to a toilet, not the night out she'd expected to have. Savannah then closed the cubicle door, pulled a 3-inch blade from her pocket and wedged it into the thin slot of the bolt, twisting it to lock the door shut. She stripped herself, taking off her t-shirt, combats, and boots until she was in her underwear, and put on the other woman's black dress. After some effort trying to zip up the back herself, she turned her attention to the escort's handbag. She pulled the purse out and checked the driving license. Chardonnay Elizabeth McLaren Jones, age 28. Chardonnay. Savannah couldn't resist a chuckle. She knew her own name was unusual, but who the hell was named after a fucking wine? She took out a small brush and ran it through her hair a few times, making sure it was straight and neat. Next, she decided some makeup wouldn't go amiss. She applied some lipstick, albeit with an unsteady hand and much difficulty. Her hand slipped, and she ended up with a crimson streak going up towards her nose. Shit. She went into another cubicle, took out some toilet paper, ran it under the tap and used it to wipe it off and try again. The second attempt was more successful, and she managed to apply a crimson sheen to her lips that glossed. She decided against anything more elaborate like mascara, knowing she'd only screw it up, and instead sprayed some of her cologne on herself. She looked in the mirror and inspected herself. The dress was slightly too long, and looked baggy in the chest, the escort being more endowed in that region than she was. "I look ridiculous," she grumbled. Why people dressed like this, she didn't know. She was more than happy to wear combats and boots, something practical. Why wear something you're not comfortable in? She thought. Unhappy with how she looked in the dress, but satisfied she couldn't do anything more, she took the handbag, threw the license away, and replaced it with the injector Malenkov had given her. She'd already slotted the vial into it, and all she needed to do was jab it into him, and it would do the rest. She went back into the bar, leaving the unconscious escort taped up and tied to the toilet. She spotted Ellison still sat at the bar and nursing his beer, but she ignored him and sat down on her own at the bar. The front entrance opened again, and Savannah saw the target coming in. Kevin Westinghouse was dressed in a crisp blue suit, silk shirt, and even from a distance he absolutely reeked of money. He was followed by 2 large, burly men in cheaper suits, who remained several feet behind. She got up and stepped towards him, offering her hand. "Mr. Westinghouse." She smiled. "What's this?" He frowned at her. "I'd booked Chardonnay. Where is she?" "She had a last-minute emergency," Savannah said, thinking quickly. "And they asked me to cover." She smiled seductively. "I hope you don't mind. I can make it up to you." She stroked his shoulder. Westinghouse looked her up and down, inspecting her and trying to decide if he would go ahead or not. He didn't like surprises or people changing plans at the last minute. Sure, he decided. He'd had a shitty day, and even though she wasn't Chardonnay, she was still very attractive, though a little more effort with her appearance wouldn't have gone amiss. She looked like she'd been called up at literally the very last minute and had been dressed by a blind man. "Half the rate I'd have paid for Chardonnay," he said, still not too happy that his evening had been altered and he hadn't even been told about it. "Half's fine," Savannah said, still pretending to smile. This guy annoyed her already. Just like the assholes who'd taken advantage of her when she'd been a teenager. She knew it was going to take a supreme act of will to keep up the charade. Fuck it, she thought. She'd done it before, only for drugs and booze. She could pretend to do it again, at least until she got him alone anyway. He seemed to relax and took a seat next to her at the bar. The two goons sat at a table behind them and chatted quietly to each other. Westinghouse got the attention of a barman and ordered a double scotch. "What are you having?" he asked Savannah. "I don't really drink," she replied. The frown on his face made her realize she'd made some kind of mistake already. She didn't want to have a drink because she didn't want to end up getting drunk and ruining the job. They only had one shot at this, and she didn't want to mess it up. "Medium white," he told the barman, ordering for her. "Coming up," he replied, rushing to get a glass. A glass of scotch and a white wine were placed in front of them, and the barman left them to it. "So, what do you do?" Savannah asked him. "Imports and exports," Westinghouse told her. "What kind of things?" She continued, pretending to be interested. "Whatever people need," he replied cryptically. "Sounds exciting." "Tell me about it." Savannah kept her eyes glued to him, but when he took a sip of his drink, she cast a quick glance to Ellison, who was sipping his beer still and subtly watching her. "Let's just say I give people what they want." Another coy false smile beamed from Savannah's face as she traced her forefinger up and down his arm. "I bet you're really good at that," she said. "Tell me more." "I don't really like to talk about work," Westinghouse told her. "I'm here for pleasure, not business." "I know just what you mean," she said, a devilish, seductive grin on her lips. She smiled coyly as she took a small sip of the wine. "I deserve a fucking Oscar," she thought to herself. "Shall we go back to yours?" She figured he'd known exactly what kind of evening he was going to have with Chardonnay, and the drinks and conversation were only a cursory beginning. A sly grin spread across Westinghouse's mouth, and he nodded. "You're very forward. Chardonnay and I usually have a few drinks first, take it slow and enjoy ourselves." "Let's just say that I like to get straight to the main course," she said suggestively. He nodded again and took her hand as he stood up. He looked at his two bodyguards and nodded. They returned the gesture, and he led Savannah away from the bar, but not out the front entrance. The bar was in a hotel, and he led her towards the staircase going up to the rooms. Shit. That wasn't part of their plan. She cast a look at Ellison and screamed inside her head to abort and get out. They were meant to take him out discreetly. How were they going to get rid of the body from a busy hotel? She let him lead her up the stairs to the first floor, where they went down a corridor, and he stopped outside a room. She noted the number, 107, and memorized it. It was going wrong already. The only plus side was his goons had stayed put in the bar. Westinghouse opened the door for her and allowed her to go in first. She nervously stepped into the room and immediately knew something wasn't right. After years living in hiding from the machines, having to be extra careful to avoid them and, more importantly, see and hear them coming even in the dark. Her senses had been fine-tuned, and she could tell someone else was already in the room with her. She heard breathing coming from further in, even though it was so dark she saw nothing. A pair of hands roughly shoved her into the room from behind, and she quickly regained her footing, but not before Westinghouse had turned the light on and closed the door behind her. Now the room was lit up. She saw she'd been right. A large man with a balding head and crooked nose stared at her from a chair as he got up and approached. A fist slammed into the back of her head, and Savannah stumbled forwards, dazed for a second, before she turned round and launched a punch of her own into the man's face. But the balding gorilla grabbed her from behind and pinned her arms up. "Fuck off." She smacked the back of her head against his nose and felt warm blood spray on her hair as well as a crunch of snapping cartilage. His grip loosened, but not enough for her to free herself before Westinghouse kicked her hard in the stomach, and she sagged to the ground with the wind knocked out of her. He flipped her onto her back and punched her in the face twice, stunning her and spattering blood from her lips onto the carpet as the inside of her mouth was cut by her teeth. He sat on her chest and used his knees to pin her shoulders and arms to the ground. "Who the fuck are you?" He snapped angrily at Savannah, looking down at her with merciless eyes. Chardonnay cancels at the last minute something she hasn't done once in 2 years. Then you show up, dressed like crap and clearly not sent from the agency. "So, who are you?" Savannah said nothing and simply spat up into his face. He wiped the globule off with the back of his hand and simply transferred it back onto her face as he dug his fingers into her cheeks with his other hand, holding her head down. He turned to the other man. "Check her bag," he ordered him. The larger man rummaged through and quickly found the case, which he opened to reveal the sodium thiopentothal in the injector. Westinghouse nodded in understanding and turned back to Savannah. "That's for me, I take it," he said. "Who are you working for?" Still, Savannah made no reply, but that didn't matter a jot to him. Not yet. With one nod from him, his associate handed him the injector, and he jabbed it into the meat of her thigh. She winced as the needle penetrated the skin and muscle of her leg, and a cold rush ran through her thigh as the powerful barbiturates coursed their way through her. She tried to push back and fight against them, free herself, but all her strength abandoned her and she couldn't break his grip. Within seconds, she couldn't even summon up the will to try. She just lay there on the floor as the world spun around her. She was spinning, floating up, and everything went blurry and faded to blackness. "Can I get you another, sir?" A barmaid in a pressed blouse and waistcoat asked Ellison as she picked up his empty bottle of beer. "No, thank you," he said, not really wanting to pay the daylight robbery prices they were charging, nor wanting to slow his reactions in any way or distract himself. "I'm just waiting for a friend." "The woman with the long red hair?" she asked. "She left just a minute ago with another gentleman. Don't think the poor thing can handle her drink. She looked out of it." Her words slapped Ellison hard in the face, and his heart almost skipped a beat as the blood drained from his face. "Which way did she go?" he asked, looking to the front entrance. He hadn't seen them leave via the bar. "They went out the lobby. If you don't mind me saying, you're better off without her if she goes off with other men." "Shit." He cursed uncharacteristically. Savannah was in trouble. He put $5 as a tip on the table for her and shot up out of his chair. He bolted out of the bar, ran out the lobby, and saw a dark blue BMW screeching down the road in front of the hotel. He thanked God he hadn't bothered with valet parking as he ran to the Mercedes, and he got in, started the engine, and sped off after it, cursing himself for letting her go through with this. What's wrong with me? He wanted to hit himself. I never should have got her involved with Malenkov. He pushed the car faster until he saw it up in the lane to his left. He remembered all Sarah's bouts of defensive driving, surveillance and anti-surveillance techniques, and forced himself to slow down. He tucked in behind a motorcycle that was itself 2 cars behind the BMW, and made sure he drove as normally as he could so he didn't tip them off. Had they made Savannah? He asked himself, trying to rack his brain for anything he might have missed. Did he know she was working for Malenkov? Do they know about me? He thought. The 2 heavies had left shortly after Savannah had disappeared upstairs with Westinghouse, but he'd figured that would be normal, as they'd be expecting their boss to be busy for at least a few hours. They hadn't even looked at him, so he'd thought he was safe. Unless someone in the hotel mentioned to the man or his associates that Savannah had started off her night with him, but then why wasn't he next to her in the car? He wanted to believe that he'd simply chosen to take her to his home instead of a hotel room, but the thought was more wishful thinking than anything else. Savannah was in trouble. You never let me down. Her words resonated uncomfortably with him and felt bitter as they repeated themselves over and over in his head. I have, and I'm sorry, he muttered, angry at himself. But he wasn't going to let her down again. Whatever it took, he'd get her back safely. It dawned on him that it was unlikely Westinghouse managed to take Savannah by himself. He must have had help. And even if by some freak chance he hadn't, almost guaranteed that, from what Malenkov had said about him being well protected, that he'd have an entourage with him wherever it was he was taking her. 1 man against 2, 3, maybe a dozen. He realized he didn't stand a chance by himself. He followed the BMW as it turned left, glad that another car was still between him and it, and pulled out his cell phone as he straightened out. He flipped it open, scrolled down for the right number, and dialed. He didn't have to wait long for his call to be picked up. Another bonus, he thought, trying to come up with the few silver linings in this dark storm cloud. John, it's Ellison. We've got a huge problem. What is it? He heard the younger man ask, all business and no nonsense. Savannah's been kidnapped. I'm following her, but I need your help. Is Cameron with you? Yeah, of course she is, John replied. Ellison had to admit that was a stupid question. Wherever he went, Cameron would be. He'd spotted the closeness between the young man and the machine. As far as he could tell, Sarah was the only one who hadn't worked out what was going on yet. Where are you? I'm in West Hollywood, heading north up 18th Street. Savannah's in a dark blue BMW. I'm following. We're downtown. Cameron says we're 5 miles from you. Don't get too close. We'll come to you. Keep the line open and talk us through where you're going. Cameron says we can be there in 15 minutes. Thank God. Ellison almost sighed in relief before chiding himself that they weren't there yet. A lot could happen in 15 minutes. Savannah opened her eyes and saw nothing but a blur of colors spinning above her. She couldn't make out the slightest detail of anything. The next thing she was aware of was pain. Her head throbbed harshly, and she felt like she was going to throw up any second. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She just wiggled slightly, but nothing much happened. She blinked a few times, and that took some effort, and her vision started to clear. A fog clouded her mind, and she felt sluggish, worse than any hangover she'd ever experienced, and more out of it than she'd ever been on either homemade moonshine or the drugs soldiers had given her in exchange for sex. She lay there in a semi-conscious daze, staring up at a drab gray metal ceiling above her, with metal latticework above. She had no idea where she was and tried to concentrate, willing herself to wake up. Cold water splashed on her face and brought her a little closer to reality. She managed to raise her head up and look forward, and immediately wished she hadn't. Westinghouse and 3 men, all visibly armed with pistols, all laughing at the sight of her pathetic, drugged-up form laid helpless on the ground. Wakey, wakey, Westinghouse grinned. Time we had a little chat, don't you think? She tried to reply, to tell him to fuck off, but she couldn't get her lips and tongue to work together to say anything coherent. All that came out was a drunken, wordless slur. "That'll wear off soon," he told her. "Don't worry." She tried to think about what had happened, and it came back in bits and pieces to her, but not enough to fully recall it. It didn't matter, though. She'd regained enough senses to know that she was in deep shit. She ignored him and looked at her surroundings. They were in a large, filthy, empty room. Possibly a warehouse or storage room of some kind, she thought. There was no furniture, no wallpaper or paint, and she could feel bare concrete floor beneath her. Above her was a stained, off-white ceiling with dark patches of damp dotted about. Wherever they were, she realized, it was a shithole. "Get her up," Westinghouse told his men. 2 of them picked her up by her arms and lifted her up roughly. They dragged her to a wooden chair and sat her down on it. The 3rd man took a pair of handcuffs and secured her hands together behind the backrest. Savannah slumped forward in her chair and tried hard to sit up straight. With effort, she held her head up and looked straight at Westinghouse as he crouched down in front of her. "Who sent you?" he asked. Yes." He tried to lead her into it, knowing full well the druggy after effects of the sodium thiopentothal still in her veins. It'd take a while for it to clear completely from her system, so he'd try to keep it simple. I, he sighed, disappointed. This was going to take longer than he thought. "If you can't speak, then nod your head yes or no." "You can do that, right?" Slowly, she nodded. She didn't know what he was going to do to her, but it couldn't be good. She knew he wasn't going to let her go, ever. He'd get whatever he could out of her, put a bullet in her skull and bury her out in the desert, in all likelihood. She had to hold out until she found a way to escape, which would take time. "Are you a cop?" Savannah shook her head slowly. "Feds, CIA." Again, she responded by shaking her head no. "Malenkov." Savannah made no reaction this time. She remained still. "Hey." He slapped her hard in the face. "Did Malenkov send you?" No." She finally blurted out, finally able to speak, if only a little. "Someone did," one of his men sneered. "He's right," Westinghouse said to her. "Women don't hang around hotel bars with injectors full of barbiturates for fun. Someone sent you. I want to know who." He was pretty sure now who it was, but he wanted to hear if from her. "Get the can," he told one of his men. The man disappeared from Savannah's view and returned a moment later with a red steel gas can. Westinghouse thrust it forwards and splashed oily-smelling liquid into her face. She recognized it, of course. Gasoline. He thrust it more and covered her in it, before lifting it up and pouring it over her head. He tossed the can away and knelt down again so he was level with her, looking into her eyes. He pulled out a cheap plastic lighter and flicked on the flame, holding it up so she could see it. "Here's how this is gonna work. I'm gonna ask you questions and you're gonna answer them. If you don't answer, or I don't believe you, I burn you. Understand?" "Yes," Savannah nodded. She tried to sound calm, but inside she was going insane in fear. She wanted to shout and scream and struggle, but she knew it would do no good. She could tell begging wouldn't do anything. The worst part was the drug was wearing off, and sensation was starting to return to normal. The agony would be even worse. "Did Malenkov send you?" She nodded once again. "Yes," she said, aware she probably sounded pathetic and resigned. "Stupid Ukrainian fucker," he snorted. "Stubborn old man just refuses to fuck off." His goons muttered their assent and watched, looking forward to lighting the bitch up. Westinghouse turned back to her. "You one of his crew?" Savannah shook her head. "No, just one job." "In exchange for?" he asked, wondering what the price the old bastard had put on his head was. "Information." "What kind of information?" he asked, curious. Savannah remained silent, unwilling to divulge the slightest hint of what they were doing. She felt a lot clearer now and knew she couldn't say anything about Skynet, John, or Sarah. Cameron had said he was a gray in the future, but what was to say he wasn't working for them now? Either way, she refused to say a word about her friends, no matter what they did to her. Doesn't matter much to me, he shrugged. He'd gone off topic anyway. If you'd managed to stick me, where would you have taken me? I don't know, she said meekly. Don't fuck me around, he snapped, flicking the lighter back on and holding it an inch from her. I don't know, Savannah repeated. He told us to call him when the job was done. He'd come and collect you. An idea went off in his head, and he allowed himself a slight grin, pleased with himself for his cleverness. You know the number. She remained silent, thinking about how to answer that. She honestly didn't know Malenkov's phone number, but if she said that, he'd want to know who else she was working with. I've got it anyway, he shrugged again. He'd worked with Malenkov before deciding to start his own enterprise, and knew his contact numbers. He pulled out his cell phone, selected a number, and held the phone in front of Savannah's face. I'm gonna call this number. When he answers, you tell him you've got me locked up in the trunk of your car, parked up at the hotel. He'll tell you where to meet him. If you say anything else, he flicked the lighter on and off repeatedly, reinforcing the message that Savannah already well understood. Westinghouse copied the number from his phone into the one in Savannah's stolen handbag, pressed call, and held it closer to her head. He looked back to the others and put the forefinger of his free hand over his lips, indicating he wanted silence. He pressed for loudspeaker a moment before it stopped ringing, and Malenkov answered. Yes. He nodded at Savannah. It's Savannah, she said. It's done. It took longer than I thought, he replied. I had to be. Subtle, she said, thinking quickly. Very nice work. Where are you now? We're parked outside the hotel. We've got Westinghouse tied up in the Volvo's trunk. She added the last part, knowing full well Malenkov was aware what car they had. At the very least, it would be a red flag for him, and he'd be able to tell John and the others she'd been compromised. With any luck, they'd assume she was dead. She knew what John was like with his friends and allies, and just hoped Cameron would keep him from coming after her. Excellent. Bring him to my house. And what about the information we asked for? Savannah snapped, partly wanting it to seem real but mostly just in case she actually managed to get away. Regent Burke. The phone line went dead, and Westinghouse pulled it away from her. Nice job, he said. He turned to the balding guy, clearly second in command of the group after him. Call Lyons and Tandy and tell them to RV with us, and to bring the Longs. He grinned wolfishly in delight. Stupid old fucker thought he could just take him out like that. He had another thing coming. What about me? Savannah asked, dreading the answer. Sorry. Westinghouse lifted his hands up and wiggled the lighter, as if to say he had no choice. Savannah rocked wildly in her chair and shouted out, fighting against her restraints and struggling to get away from it, to no avail. This is it, she thought, doing her best to fight through sheer terror at the thought of the impending, slow, agonizing end. She'd survived years of fighting the machines, and now she was going to be burned to death by some psycho. Gunfire barked twice, and the side of Westinghouse's head exploded. The lighter dropped from his hands, and the flame extinguished, falling to the ground a second later. The arms dealer twitched once and fell to the floor. What the? Savannah looked around for her would-be savior. Who the hell's that? One of his men shouted out. The others raised their weapons and looked for a target. Come out, asshole, another called as he picked up a Kalashnikov and shouldered it. Whoever it was would get fucking enfiladed. He glanced down at his boss. Half his head was missing, and his shredded brains seeped onto the concrete floor. Another, fatter man aimed his pistol at Savannah's head. "Come on out or I blow her head off," he shouted. He tensed his finger on the trigger and took up first pressure. Another millimeter or two, and he'd blow her head off. Cameron burst into the room with her pistol raised, targeted the gangster, pointing the gun at Savannah, and shot twice. Her rounds smashed through his top front teeth and obliterated his brainstem before he could pull the trigger. "Waste the bitch." The others opened fire on her without hesitation, but the rounds were like pinpricks to Cameron. They bounced off her armored endoskeleton like raindrops, only damaging her flesh, which would heal. She rapidly targeted the others and downed them all in a hail of fire, emptying her magazine and dropping the remaining 3 gangsters like flies. John and Ellison stormed into the room and swept their weapons across, searching for targets. Instead, he saw 5 freshly blasted corpses and Cameron holding a smoking gun. "Wow," he said to her as he took in the carnage. "Could have saved some for us," he said sheepishly. He knew she was a Terminator, and all but he felt a bit embarrassed that she'd taken care of them that quickly. Cameron simply stared at him. He should know she wouldn't let him risk his life, especially against people who were inconsequential to their mission. They didn't put up much of a fight. She looked at the bodies of the men she'd killed, unimpressed. Soldiers would have moved as a unit, concentrated their shots, and used firing and maneuvering to either flank her or try to escape. With their weapons, they'd fail. But it was apparent to her, these humans possessed no training of any kind. She didn't feel any guilt about killing them. The part of her that was John Henry had considered human life sacred, but they'd been about to kill Savannah. Some people were more important than others, and John more so than anyone else. "Anyone gonna get me out of here?" Savannah asked them, looking up impatiently. "What are you even doing here?" she asked, still in shock by the swiftness and ferocity of their attack. One moment she was about to be burnt, and the next Cameron came in and massacred them without any effort. "What do you think?" John replied as Cameron stepped over to her, saw the handcuffs restraining her hands and broke them with ease. "Thanks." She stood up unsteadily and took a tentative step. Her legs didn't give out underneath her. She was fairly sure most, if not all, the drug had gone from her system. She realized she was shaking and knew it was shock. She felt cold, too. Freezing. "You're welcome," Cameron smiled. "You okay?" Ellison asked, looking at the redhead with concern. Savannah nodded slowly, as a few tears rolled down her cheek. She tried to hide it, but it was useless. She looked down at Westinghouse's bloodied corpse and kicked what was left of his head in contempt. The bastard had been a second from burning her alive. She wished Cameron hadn't killed him, only so she could beat the crap out of him. "I'll be fine," she sniffled. Suddenly, she remembered what Malenkov had told her. "He made me call Malenkov and tell him I'd got him. He was planning to drive up and take him out. When I asked on the phone about the information he'd promised, he said something. A name, Regent Burke. Doesn't ring any bells." John shook his head. Ellison was just as confused. "We'll find it out later. Let's just get the hell out of here for now." Someone must have heard the firefight and called the police, who could be here any moment. "Wait," Cameron said. She saw the AK-47. One of the gangsters had used. It was likely they had more here. A quick search turned up 2 more Kalashnikovs and several magazines in one corner. "Nice find," John smiled at her. They could always use more weapons for their arsenal. They carried the weapons out, and Ellison stayed at Savannah's side as she walked unsteadily, still shaking a little from the shock of being seconds away from a horrible, painful death. It'd wear off, but not yet. They both knew. Ellison and Savannah got into the Mercedes, the former taking the wheel and turning out as John and Cameron got into the front of the Lexus, with Danny still sat in the back. The two cars left the area quickly and headed for the highway. Not a moment too soon, John thought as he heard sirens wailing in the distance. He couldn't see them, but if they were near enough to be heard, then he knew it was too close a shave for comfort. He just hoped nobody saw them. Two words started to bug John as he sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window. He didn't say a word to Cameron or Danny. He just stared out the window, immersed in his own world as the two words repeated themselves over and over. Regent Bark. What did it mean? Was it a person, a place? Was it even the answer to the question they'd asked? When they got to Malenkov's place, he was damned well going to find out.